the 17th of January 1942. Dawn breaks cold and grey over the waters northeast of New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Navy carrier Shokaku cuts through the Pacific swells, her flight deck slick with morning mist. On the bow, a young aviation machinist's mate named Tanaka Yoshio stands beside a Mitsubishi, a 6M0, his hands working methodically through the pre-flight inspection he has performed 1,000 times. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with salt air. His fingers are steady. He has been told since flight school that the Zero is invincible, that Japanese naval aviation reigns supreme across the Pacific, that American pilots are soft, their planes inferior, their tactics predictable. Beneath the grey sky, with the engine cowling cold under his palm, Tanaka believes this absolutely. He has no reason not to. 4 months into the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy has swept aside every opponent, conquered every objective, dominated every engagement. The Americans have been driven back to Pearl Harbor's ruins, the British humiliated at Singapore, the Dutch crushed in the East Indies. Japanese carrier aviation has demonstrated a reach and precision that has rewritten naval warfare. In his pocket, Tanaka carries a letter from his mother in Hiroshima, still unopened. He will read it tonight, he tells himself, after the expected victory. The morning routine continues. Zeros are rolled into position, dive bombers are armed. The rhythmic clang of ordnance carts echoes across the deck. Everything proceeds according to doctrine, according to plan, according to the absolute confidence that has carried the Kido Butai across half an ocean. What Tanaka does not know, what none of them know yet, is that 180 miles to the south, a new kind of American aircraft is preparing to climb into the morning sky. And with it, a tactical revolution that will turn every assumption of aerial combat into deadly illusion. The dominance of Japanese naval aviation in early 1942 was not propaganda or self-delusion. It was earned through years of brutal combat experience over China, through rigorous training that culled the weak and forged the survivors into an elite force, and through technological advantages that gave Japanese pilots genuine superiority in the war's opening months. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter could outturn, outclimb, and outrange virtually any Allied aircraft it encountered. Japanese dive bomber and torpedo bomber crews had trained to a level of precision that Western observers considered almost superhuman. At Pearl Harbor, they demonstrated coordination and accuracy that sank or damaged 18 ships in under 2 hours. Off Malaya, they sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and battlecruiser Repulse with torpedo and bomb attacks that proved capital ships could not survive without air cover. In the Philippines, they destroyed American air power on the ground before it could effectively respond. In the Dutch East Indies, they swept aside Allied naval forces with casualty ratios that seemed to confirm Japanese racial theories about warrior superiority. By January 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy had established a defensive perimeter stretching from the Aleutians to New Guinea, from Wake Island to Burma, conquering in 6 months what they had expected to take 2 years. Japanese aircrew losses remained remarkably low. Replacement pilots arriving from training command found themselves entering what appeared to be an unstoppable conquering force. The tactical doctrine taught at Yokosuka and Tsuchiura air stations seemed validated by every engagement. American opposition, when it materialized at all, appeared disorganized and ineffective. But beneath this surface of triumph, vulnerabilities existed that Japanese naval aviation doctrine could not acknowledge. The training pipeline that produced such skilled pilots was narrow and slow, incapable of rapid expansion. The emphasis on offensive strike operations left little doctrinal attention to air defense. Carrier combat air patrols were maintained at minimal strength to preserve aircraft for strike missions. Fighter direction systems were rudimentary compared to American developments. Radar installations on Japanese carriers were primitive or absent entirely. Most critically, Japanese aviation doctrine had developed in a context where they possessed the initiative, where they chose when and where to strike, where enemy opposition could be overwhelmed through superior skill and coordination. The concept of sustained defensive operations against an enemy with material superiority had never been seriously contemplated, because such a scenario contradicted the fundamental premises of Japanese strategic planning. The war was supposed to end with a negotiated peace after initial Japanese victories made further American resistance too costly. Japanese industry was not configured for a long war of attrition. Aircraft production in 1941 totaled approximately 5,000 planes, respectable for a regional power, catastrophically insufficient for sustained combat against American industrial capacity. Pilot training took 2 years to produce fleet-ready aviators, a pipeline impossible to accelerate without devastating quality decline. These structural weaknesses remained hidden behind the blaze of early victories, but they existed, waiting like stress fractures in steel. The aircraft that would exploit these fractures was born not from tactical innovation, but from desperation and bureaucratic accident. The Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber entered service in 1940 as a replacement for earlier scout and light bomber designs. It was not particularly fast. Maximum speed of 255 miles per hour made it slower than the Zero by 100 miles per hour. It was not particularly maneuverable. The heavy airframe and fixed landing gear created significant drag. It was not glamorous. Pilots called it slow but deadly, with more resignation than pride. What it possessed, however, was structural strength that bordered on the excessive. The airframe could withstand dive angles up to 70 degrees, could pull out of dives with G-forces that would tear apart lighter designs, could absorb combat damage, and continue flying. It carried a substantial bomb load, 1,000 pounds under the fuselage, plus smaller bombs under the wings, and it possessed dive brakes that allowed precise control during near-vertical attacks. The Norden bombsight derivatives installed in SBDs gave crews the ability to place ordnance with remarkable accuracy. Equally important, though less celebrated, was its range. The SBD could operate at distances that matched or exceeded Japanese carrier aircraft, giving American carriers tactical flexibility in choosing engagement ranges. In mock combat exercises before the war, SBD crews had discovered something that challenged conventional wisdom about dive bomber vulnerability. When pressed by fighters, when unable to escape through speed, a well-flown SBD diving at maximum angle became extraordinarily difficult to hit. The near-vertical dive created a constantly changing three-dimensional problem for pursuing fighters. Deflection angles shifted radically, closure rates became extreme. The SBD's structural strength allowed it to maintain the dive far longer than opponents expected, pulling out at altitudes that seemed suicidal. Fighters attempting to follow often found themselves overshooting, unable to match the SBD's dive angle without losing control or structural failure. On American carriers across the Pacific in early 1942, SBD crews were learning to weaponize this defensive maneuver. At Coral Sea in May, at Midway in June, the tactic would prove devastatingly effective. But the conceptual seeds were planted earlier, in the scattered engagements following Pearl Harbor, when American dive bomber crews found themselves hunted by the vaunted Zeros, and discovered that survival sometimes lay not in evasion, but in embracing the vertical dimension with absolute commitment. What resulted was not merely a maneuver, but a psychological weapon. The image of an American dive bomber entering a near 90-degree dive, plunging toward the ocean at terminal velocity, became something that violated the experiential framework Japanese fighter pilots had constructed through years of aerial combat. It appeared to be suicide. Every tactical instinct, every hour of training, every principle of aerial combat doctrine said that no pilot would deliberately enter an uncontrolled vertical dive at combat altitude, that structural failure or impact was certain, that this was desperation, not tactics. Yet American crews did it repeatedly, and they pulled out, and they escaped, and Japanese fighters following them discovered that their own aircraft could not match the maneuver without catastrophic results. Tanaka's carrier would not encounter American dive bombers on that January morning in 1942. The engagement would come later, in battles whose names would be written in fire across the Pacific. But across the American carrier fleet, in ready rooms and on flight decks, the tactics were being refined. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who would lead the dive bomber strike that devastated the Japanese carrier fleet at Midway, was drilling his squadrons in dive angles that pushed engineering specifications to their limits. Ensign George Gay, who would survive the slaughter of Torpedo Squadron 8 only to witness the dive bomber attack that avenged them, was learning to handle his TBD Devastator in ways the design manual never anticipated. On Enterprise and Yorktown and Lexington, crew chiefs were reinforcing airframe attachment points, strengthening wing spars, recalibrating dive brakes. The institutional knowledge was spreading through the community of naval aviation that, in extremis, when pursued by superior fighters, the vertical dive offered not just escape but a form of offensive defense, turning the American aircraft's greatest liability into an unexpected advantage. The first confirmed instance of a Japanese fighter pilot expressing terror at American dive bomber tactics came from after-action reports following the Battle of Coral Sea on May 7 and 8, 1942. Japanese fighter ace Saburo Sakai, flying from carrier Zuikaku, recorded in his combat journal an encounter with American SBDs that violated his understanding of aerial combat. Sakai had shot down more than 20 Allied aircraft by that point in the war. He had never encountered an opponent he considered superior. His Zero could outturn anything the Americans flew. His gunnery was precise. His tactical instincts had been honed over years of combat. But the American dive bombers, when cornered, when his guns were tracking toward a certain kill, would suddenly roll inverted and enter dives so steep they appeared vertical. Sakai initially assumed these were death spirals, damaged aircraft going down. He followed the first one, intending to confirm the kill, and found himself unable to maintain position. His Zero, stressed beyond safe limits, began to shudder. The dive angle exceeded what his aircraft could sustain. He pulled out at 3,000 feet, looking back to see where the American had crashed. The SBD was still flying, skimming the wave tops, heading back toward its carrier. Sakai's report described the experience with unusual emotion for a combat veteran. The Americans, he wrote, flew like men who did not fear death, or perhaps like men who understood something about their machines that made what appeared to be suicide into survivable tactics. This was not an isolated incident. As American carrier task forces began offensive operations in the spring and summer of 1942, Japanese fighter pilots encountered the phenomenon repeatedly. At Midway, Zero pilot Shigematsu Yasuhiro recorded pursuing an SBD away from the burning carrier Akagi. The American rear gunner had wounded Yasuhiro's wingman, and Yasuhiro closed for revenge. The SBD's pilot saw him coming. Instead of attempting evasive turns, instead of staying low where the Zero's superior speed would quickly close the gap, the American climbed to 3,000 feet and then rolled into a dive that Yasuhiro later described as perpendicular to the ocean. Yasuhiro followed, his fighter's superior speed giving him initial closure advantage. But as the altimeter unwound 2,000 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet, Yasuhiro's aircraft began to vibrate violently. The dive angle was too steep, the airspeed too high. He could see the American still ahead, still in control, still diving. At 200 feet, Yasuhiro pulled out, his vision graying from G-forces, his aircraft groaning. The American pulled out moments later, impossibly low, and disappeared into a cloud bank. Yasuhiro flew back to his carrier shaken. In the ready room afterward, other pilots shared similar experiences. One described it as fighting ghosts. Another said the Americans had built aircraft specifically designed to make Japanese fighters follow them to death. The psychological impact of this tactic operated on multiple levels. At the immediate tactical level, it denied Japanese fighter pilots the easy kills they had come to expect against American bombers. Pre-war doctrine assumed dive bombers were vulnerable once separated from fighter escort, that their slow speed and limited maneuverability made them relatively simple targets. The vertical dive tactic invalidated this assumption, forcing Japanese fighters to either break off pursuit or follow into an aerodynamic regime where the SBD's structural advantages became lethal. At a deeper level, It challenged the narrative of Japanese technical and tactical superiority that undergirded morale throughout the fleet. Japanese pilots had been taught that American aviators were soft, that they lacked fighting spirit, that they would flee when pressed. The image of an American crew deliberately entering what appeared to be a death dive rather than surrender created cognitive dissonance. It suggested a form of fatalism or courage that contradicted the racial and cultural stereotypes Japanese military culture promoted. If Americans were willing to die rather than be captured, if they possessed tactical innovations that negated Japanese advantages, what did that mean for the war's trajectory? These questions did not emerge consciously in most Japanese pilots' minds. During 1942, the string of victories continued. The war seemed winnable, but doubt's seeds were planted. The symbolism of the vertical dive extended beyond tactics into metaphor. In Japanese military culture, the banzai charge, the kamikaze spirit, the willingness to die for emperor and nation, were celebrated as uniquely Japanese virtues that gave the imperial military supernatural strength. The idea that Americans' materialistic, individualistic, racially mongrel Americans might possess their own version of fatalistic courage was philosophically disturbing. Yet here were American pilots deliberately entering maneuvers that seemed suicidal, trusting in their machines and their skills, with the same absolute commitment Japanese pilots brought to their missions. The dive became a symbol of American industrial philosophy applied to aerial combat. Japan built aircraft for maneuverability and range, accepting fragility as necessary trade-off. America built aircraft for strength and firepower, accepting weight penalties. When pushed to extremes, when doctrine failed and survival demanded improvisation, these design philosophies produced different tactical possibilities. The SBD could survive the vertical dive because American engineers had overbuilt it, because factory workers in El Segundo had riveted structural members to specifications that exceeded nominal requirements, because the entire industrial culture valued robustness over elegance. Japanese aircraft were often more sophisticated, more efficient, more refined. American aircraft were brutish, excessive, redundant. In the vertical dive, American engineering excess became devastating tactical advantage. By mid-1942, Japanese naval aviation was beginning a decline it could never reverse. At Coral Sea, the carrier Shokaku was damaged, and Zuikaku lost most of its air group. At Midway, 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiryu were sunk with their entire complements of aircraft and most of their irreplaceable, experienced crews. Those losses removed the core of Japanese naval aviation's striking power. Replacement pilots arriving from training command lacked the experience of the veterans lost in 1942. Training standards were lowered to increase output, which decreased quality, which increased combat losses, which necessitated further training compromises. The death spiral had begun. American dive bomber crews, meanwhile, were becoming increasingly proficient. The SBD's structural strength allowed rookies to survive mistakes that would kill pilots in more delicate aircraft. Veterans accumulated hundreds of combat hours, developing tactical innovations that spread through the community. Radio communications allowed fighter directors on carriers to vector SBDs away from danger when possible, and toward targets when opportunity arose. Radar installations on American carriers gave warning of approaching Japanese strikes, allowing combat air patrols to be positioned optimally. The material and doctrinal advantages began to compound. The transformation in Japanese pilot psychology manifested most clearly in accounts from the battles of late 1942 and 1943. At Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Zero pilot Nakajima Tadashi recorded an engagement with American SBDs that illustrated the changed dynamic. Nakajima intercepted a section of 3 SBDs, withdrawing from an unsuccessful attack on Japanese carriers. He expected routine kills. Instead, the Americans climbed to 5,000 feet, formed into a defensive triangle, and waited. When Nakajima attacked, all 3 simultaneously rolled into near-vertical dives. Nakajima followed the closest, but his wingmen broke off immediately. They had learned from earlier experiences that following Americans through these dives was often fatal. Nakajima continued alone, determined to prove Japanese superiority. At 1,000 feet, his Zero began to buffet violently. The airframe wasn't designed for this abuse. He pulled out, disoriented and frustrated. Looking up, he saw the other two SBDs had pulled out and were climbing again. The third, the one he'd pursued, was gone, either crashed or escaped. Nakajima flew back to his carrier, having expended ammunition and fuel for no confirmed kills. In his after-action report, he noted bitterly that American tactics had become cowardly but effective. The word choice revealed the psychological tension. Calling the tactic cowardly preserved the narrative of Japanese moral superiority, but acknowledging effectiveness conceded the practical outcome. As 1943 progressed, and American industrial production began flooding the Pacific with new carriers and aircraft, the tactical balance shifted decisively. Japanese fighters still possessed performance advantages in certain regimes, but they were increasingly outnumbered, increasingly supported by degraded radar and communications infrastructure, increasingly flown by pilots with inadequate training. American SBD squadrons, by contrast, operated from carriers with sophisticated fighter direction capabilities, with experienced air groups that had survived multiple combat tours, with logistics chains that ensured maintenance and replacement aircraft. The vertical dive tactic evolved from desperate defensive measure to standard operating procedure taught to every new SBD crew. Training squadrons in the United States practiced the maneuver until it became instinctive. Engineering teams analyzed combat reports and further strengthened airframes. What had begun as improvisation became institutionalized excellence. The symbolic weight of this transformation was not lost on Japanese strategic planners by late 1943. The Americans had taken what appeared to be an inferior aircraft, slower, less maneuverable, aesthetically crude, and through industrial might and tactical innovation, transformed it into a weapon that Japanese fighters could not reliably counter. This mirrored the larger strategic reality. Japan had entered the war with superior pilots, superior tactics, and in some areas, superior technology. But America possessed vastly superior industrial capacity and superior ability to institutionalize and disseminate tactical innovations and superior logistics to sustain operations. The vertical dive became metaphor for the war itself. American forces absorbing initial defeats, adapting, and eventually overwhelming Japanese opposition through material excess and systemic advantages that individual Japanese courage and skill could not overcome. For the Japanese airmen who survived the war's middle years, the memory of American dive bombers entering those impossible near-vertical dives remained psychologically scarring. Post-war interviews conducted by American military historians recorded numerous accounts of Japanese pilots describing the specific terror of pursuing an SBD into a dive and realizing too late that their own aircraft could not sustain the maneuver, that they were seconds from structural failure or loss of control, that the American crew had turned the Japanese fighters' superior speed into a liability. Several veterans described recurring nightmares of following American aircraft into dives that never ended, the ocean rising up, the aircraft shaking apart, the realization that they had been trapped by an opponent they had dismissed as inferior. These accounts reveal the psychological dimension of technological warfare. Courage and skill matter enormously in combat, but when weaponry and tactics favor one side, individual excellence cannot compensate indefinitely. Japanese pilots in 1942 were among the finest aviators in the world. By 1944, most were dead, killed not primarily by superior American skill, but by cumulative material advantages that made survival increasingly impossible, regardless of individual capability. The SBD Dauntless itself became an object of grudging respect among Japanese aviators. Post-war technical examinations of captured American aircraft revealed design details that Japanese engineers found fascinating and troubling. The structural redundancy, The multiple hydraulic systems, the armored crew positions, the self-sealing fuel tanks all represented design philosophy, fundamentally different from Japanese approaches. Where Japanese engineers minimized weight to maximize performance, American engineers accepted weight penalties to maximize survivability and reliability. Neither approach was inherently superior in abstract terms, but in the context of the Pacific War, where American industrial capacity could replace losses, while Japanese capacity could not. The American philosophy proved more sustainable. The SBD could absorb battle damage that would down a Zero or a Kate, could be repaired by carrier maintenance crews with less specialized labor, could be flown by adequately trained pilots, rather than requiring elite veterans. These characteristics, initially viewed as evidence of American inferiority by Japanese observers, proved to be strategic advantages in a war of attrition. The vertical dive tactic also influenced Japanese defensive doctrine in ways that compounded their strategic disadvantages. By late 1943, Japanese carrier combat air patrol doctrine had shifted toward maintaining higher altitude reserves, specifically to counter American dive bomber attacks. This theoretically sound adjustment had unintended consequences. Keeping fighters at altitude meant fewer fighters at medium altitude where American torpedo bombers operated. American strike packages began deliberately exploiting this. Torpedo bombers would attack first, drawing fighters down, and then dive bombers would attack from altitude before fighters could climb back up. The vertical dive tactic, originally a defensive measure for isolated SBDs, became integrated into coordinated strike doctrine that systematically overwhelmed Japanese defenses. Japanese fighter directors faced impossible choices: defend against high-altitude dive bombers or low-altitude torpedo bombers, but not both simultaneously with the limited fighters available. American strike coordinators learned to time their attacks to maximize this dilemma, and Japanese carriers increasingly suffered from attacks they could see coming, but lacked the resources to stop. One particular engagement illustrates the complete tactical evolution. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American carrier groups detected incoming Japanese strikes at extreme range using advanced radar. Fighter directors vectored massive combat air patrols to intercept, while keeping dive bomber and torpedo bomber crews on deck, ready to launch counterstrike. The Japanese strike, composed of increasingly poorly trained pilots in increasingly obsolete aircraft, was largely destroyed before reaching American carriers. Survivors limped back to find American dive bombers and torpedo bombers already attacking their carriers. Japanese fighter reserves had been committed forward to escort the strike and were not available for defense. The few fighters remaining on combat air patrol were overwhelmed by American fighter sweeps. SBD crews, now veterans with multiple combat tours, hit Japanese carriers with devastating accuracy, while Japanese anti-aircraft fire proved inadequate to the challenge. Several Japanese pilots recorded radio transmissions during the battle that intelligence officers later transcribed. One Zero pilot, defending carrier Tai-Ho, transmitted that American dive bombers were falling like meteors. We cannot intercept them. They pull out too low. There are too many. The transmission ended abruptly. Tai-Ho survived the dive bomber attack only to explode hours later from avgas fumes igniting below decks. The terror Japanese airmen experienced when facing American dive bombers in vertical dives was thus not irrational fear or lack of courage. It was appropriate recognition of tactical reality. They were being asked to counter a maneuver their aircraft could not safely perform, using doctrine that had not contemplated this scenario, with degrading support infrastructure, against increasingly numerous and capable opponents. The specific image, American aircraft entering near 90-degree dives, plunging toward the ocean at terminal velocity, became emblematic of larger operational helplessness. Japanese fighter pilots were still among the finest aviators in the world in 1944 and 1945, but individual excellence could not overcome systemic disadvantages. When an American dive bomber entered that characteristic near-vertical plunge, it represented not just a difficult tactical problem, but an entire industrial and doctrinal system designed to make such maneuvers survivable and effective. Pursuing them meant confronting not just a single aircraft, but the accumulated advantages of American design philosophy, manufacturing capacity, tactical innovation, and institutional learning. By 1945, the SBD Dauntless was being phased out in favor of the more modern SB-2C Helldiver, but its legacy remained. American naval aviators had learned that apparent limitations could be transformed into advantages through creativity and courage. That the enemy's superior performance in conventional metrics, speed, maneuverability, could be neutralized through tactics that exploited different dimensions of combat. That structural robustness and engineering excess, initially seen as wasteful, created tactical possibilities unavailable to more refined designs. These lessons extended beyond the SBD to American military culture generally. The willingness to build redundancy into systems, to over-engineer solutions, to accept inefficiency in exchange for reliability and survivability, these became hallmarks of American military procurement and doctrine in ways that persist to the present day. For the young aviation machinist's mate Tanaka, standing on the deck of Shokaku that January morning in 1942, the future was invisible. He would survive Coral Sea and Midway, would be transferred to land-based air units as carrier strength declined, would eventually die in the Philippines in late 1944 when his Zero was hit by anti-aircraft fire while attempting to intercept American bombers attacking Manila. He never wrote about whether he personally encountered American dive bombers executing vertical dives, but others in his unit did. They spoke about it in the ready rooms, in the maintenance areas, in letters home that Navy censors sometimes allowed to pass. The Americans had aircraft that could fall from the sky like stones and survive. The Americans had pilots who would dive toward death rather than accept being shot down. The Americans had engineering that made impossible maneuvers routine. These observations accumulated in the collective consciousness of Japanese naval aviation as the war ground on, as losses mounted, as the experienced veterans disappeared one by one, and replacements fresh from abbreviated training took their places. The terror was real because it was rational. When an SBD rolled inverted and dove vertically, it announced that American industrial capacity had created machines that could survive abuse Japanese aircraft could not, that American tactical doctrine had evolved to exploit this advantage, that individual Japanese excellence was insufficient to counter systemic American strengths. For warriors trained to believe that spirit could overcome material, that Japanese cultural virtues ensured victory, that Bushido and determination mattered more than production statistics, the vertical dive became existential challenge to their worldview. How does one maintain morale when the enemy demonstrates advantages that courage cannot overcome? How does one continue fighting when tactical innovations render one's own training and doctrine obsolete? How does one explain increasing losses to comrades and to oneself when the explanation requires acknowledging uncomfortable truths about industrial capacity and strategic overreach? These questions did not surface explicitly during the war. Japanese military culture did not allow such doubt to be spoken aloud. But in private journals, in letters home, in post-war memoirs, the evidence accumulates. The American dive bombers that could plunge vertically and escape were not just tactical problems, but symbols of a war being lost, of advantages squandered, of industrial realities that made ultimate defeat inevitable. Once initial surprise, victories could not force negotiated peace. The terror Japanese fighter pilots felt when watching an SBD enter its dive was thus multi-layered immediate tactical concern about following safely, broader recognition of American material advantages, and perhaps inchoate awareness that this single maneuver represented everything wrong with Japan's strategic position. In the end, the vertical dive stood as testament to competing philosophies of warfare. Japan built aircraft for elite pilots to achieve decisive tactical victories through superior skill and determination. America built aircraft for adequately trained pilots to achieve strategic victory through overwhelming material advantage and systematic tactical evolution. Neither approach was morally superior. Both killed efficiently. Both demanded courage from those who implemented them. But in the context of the Pacific War, the American approach proved more sustainable because it could absorb losses Japan could not, could institutionalize innovations Japan could not match, and could produce quantities Japan could not counter. The SBD's ability to survive vertical dives became microcosm of this larger reality. American engineering excess, initially dismissed as inefficient, created tactical possibilities that Japanese refinement and efficiency could not duplicate. The image of an American crew diving their heavy bomber nearly straight down, trusting absolutely in their machine and their skills, pulling out impossibly low and escaping that image, haunted Japanese fighter pilots, because it was everything their doctrine said should not work, but which worked anyway, repeatedly, devastatingly, until the question was no longer whether American tactics were effective, but whether Japanese tactics could ever counter them. And so the war continued, with each side learning and adapting, but only one side possessing the industrial capacity and institutional structure to implement those lessons at scale. The terror Japanese airmen experienced was not failure of courage, but recognition of truth. When that SBD rolled inverted and dove toward the ocean, it carried with it the weight of American steel mills and aircraft factories, of training programs that graduated thousands of pilots monthly, of logistics chains that supplied remote Pacific atolls with more ordnance than Japan produced annually, of an industrial democracy at war that could absorb early defeats and emerge stronger precisely because it built excess into every system, redundancy into every design, and tactical flexibility into every doctrine. The vertical dive was not just aerodynamic maneuver, but industrial philosophy made kinetic, and for the Japanese pilots who witnessed it and survived, it announced more clearly than any intelligence report or strategic assessment that the war they thought they could win was already being lost in the factories of California and the training fields of Texas, one over-engineered dive bomber at a time, falling from the sky like judgment, pulling out at the last impossible moment, and flying home to rearm and return again tomorrow.